Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is my colleague, senior editor Dan Alexander. Dan,
Hey.
Thanks for coming on in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You have been in New York now for the past couple of weeks, on and off, covering former President Donald Trump's fraud case. You recently wrote a piece about his daughter, Ivanka, entitled, "Ivanka Trump Helped Her Dad Lie About His Net Worth." Can you explain what happened here?
Yeah, so in 2015, Donald Trump was meeting with 3 Forbes journalists, as he often has over the years, and trying to convince them that he was richer than he actually was. And so in the course of this effort, he threw out false profitability numbers, false square footage numbers, many of the same sorts of lies that were embedded in the underlying math for the numbers that actually ended up going to the banks. But also as part of this effort, he employed his daughter Ivanka, and so he brings Ivanka into the room, and Ivanka, like her father, makes many statements that are just provably false. So she says in one instance that Doral, which is a golf resort down in Miami, has no debt on it. In fact, it had $125 million of debt on it. She claims that their interest rates were lower than they actually were. It's all consistent with sort of what she had learned from her father, but it shows that she was actively involved in pushing these same sort of lies to fool the world into thinking that Donald Trump was richer than he actually was.
So $0 of debt is obviously a world of difference from $125 million worth of debt. So did she knowingly lie, or was she blind to this, just going off of what her dad was saying? Can you walk us through that?
Oh, she knew. Ivanka was heavily involved in the efforts to secure these loans. She was, in many ways, kind of the point person with the main private wealth banker at Deutsche Bank, Rosemary Vrablich, that the Trump organization was working with on this particular loan and other loans. So there's no world in which Ivanka Trump could have forgotten that they had $125 million of debt on that property.
Forbes journalists, as you said, were involved in this story back in 2015. I want to read a line from your story. You wrote, quote, "To fully understand Ivanka's involvement in her father's deceit, it helps to get inside the room where the lying took place." 3 Forbes journalists were there, so can you paint a picture, take us into that room?
Yeah, so, they had him in Trump Tower, and, Trump basically goes through asset by asset. Trump's a showman. He's amazing at putting on a display, and that's what he's doing in this instance. Now, remember, this is in September of 2015, so Donald Trump at the time is suddenly the front runner for the Republican nomination, and is, everybody's still very skeptical that he's a serious political candidate, but suddenly he is a serious political candidate. And in the midst of all of that, he blocks off a couple of hours in the middle of his day to go through asset by asset and take Forbes through all of these things that he owns, and gets down into the details of them, what the net operating income is, what the square footage figures are, what the acreage is. He has pictures that he's pulling out to show everybody, to impress them of how beautiful his properties are, all in hopes that the final number that Forbes places on his net worth will be higher.
And were the journalists fooled by this? Could they see through Trump's lies?
So, nobody's been fooled fully by Trump for a long time. But part of what Trump has done so smartly, I guess, is if you tell enough lies, it's very difficult to catch all of them. So, for instance, in that case, Donald Trump claimed that his penthouse was 33,000 square feet. The math that he sent to the banks claimed that it was 30,000 square feet. The penthouse was actually 10,996 square feet, so about a third of what he was claiming. Now, at the time, the journalists went through the penthouse, looked at it, saw it. It's a huge place, 11,000 square feet, it's a ton of square footage. And they thought that it could have been close to 30,000 square feet. It wasn't until a couple of years later, digging more closely into the numbers and looking at property documents, that one of the people who was there in that room, Chase Peterson Withorn, unraveled the fact that, in fact, the penthouse was 3 times smaller than what Donald Trump was claiming. And so there are lots of little details like that although you can catch many of the lies, it's hard to catch every single one of them. And an interesting thing is that when we saw the credit reports from Deutsche Bank, his main lender, they were fooled on all sorts of things. And so, yes, people have been calling him out on his lies for a long time. Yes, people have understood that he's not truthful about how much he's worth, but that still doesn't make it easy to catch everything.
I really want to get to the why here. So in that room in 2015, former President Donald Trump, who was then a candidate at that time, Trump org CFO Alan Weisselberg, along with Ivanka Trump, were tag teaming in these lies. Why was that? Is it just for vanity or something else?
Vanity is a big part of it, but it's also for financing. So banks, when they're lending to someone, if they understand that the person who's borrowing money is richer, then they're more likely to charge them lower interest rates. It's simple. They think they're going to get paid back more easily because, hey, sure, if the one property has trouble, then they can go after other assets that the person holds, particularly if the loans are personally guaranteed, as the Deutsche Bank loans were. So the richer you are, the more money you save in the financing world. And what we've seen now that we've looked at these Deutsche Bank credit reports is just how fooled they were by some of Trump's lies. And if you look at the lies that he was telling the media and the lies that he was telling the banks, it was clearly all part of a concerted effort because many of them are the same exact lies. And so that's really the why. It's good for financing. And same idea as we talked about a second ago. You might not fool them on everything, but if you're a Deutsche Bank underwriter, and you say, hey, he says he's worth $6 billion, Forbes says he's worth $3 billion, let's cut him to 3.5. But he might actually be worth $2 billion. And so you've just overestimated his net worth by $1.5 billion.
And I do want to get back to Ivanka Trump. Did she lie for personal reasons, or did she lie just to help out her dad?
In this case, she was lying to help out her dad because he owns the assets. Ivanka Trump and her two older brothers, Don Jr. and Eric, owned at 1.7% of the Washington, D.C. hotel, but they don't really own significant parts of the other assets, including this Miami golf resort. So really these lies are for her dad. But remember, anything that's in the service of her dad is also in the service of her, because ultimately where are these assets going to go once he passes away? Well, they're going to go to his kids, including Ivanka. And at the time, she was actively working in his business. And so just as somebody might do something that's not directly beneficial to them, but is beneficial to their boss and therefore indirectly beneficial to them, that's sort of the way to think about Ivanka's lies in that moment.
And she was supposed to testify earlier, but has gotten out of it time and time again. She is now supposed to testify this week. How was she able to get out of it for so long?
So Ivanka will be on the stand tomorrow. She's not a defendant in this case, as her brothers Eric and Don Jr. are. The reason that is because she left to go to the White House. And when Donald Trump pulled her to Washington, that meant that her time at the Trump Organization ended sooner than the statute of limitations in this case. And so she no longer is a defendant. But she is going to have to face difficult questioning tomorrow. And I expect her, to be poised but defensive and very careful with her words. Much different approach than we saw her father yesterday.
Let's talk about her brother's testimony. How do you think that will differ from her testimony as well as the father, former President Donald Trump?
Well, her brothers are in more danger because they are defendants in the case, because they didn't go to the White House. So the brothers' strategy was basically to say, I didn't have anything to do with any of this. For Don Jr., that was a more credible strategy. For Eric Trump, there are piles of documents and emails that the Attorney General's office has that show that he was involved in some of the calculations to figure out what his father's net worth was. For Ivanka, I expect her to also try to distance herself, but maybe not to be quite as gun-shy, because she just has a little bit less on the line in the actual case. And of course, she doesn't want to get herself in additional legal problems by committing perjury.
I do want to read some headlines and get your reaction to them. They are some headlines about her upcoming testimony. The Daily Beast wrote an op-ed entitled, "Ivanka is not going to save Trump in his New York fraud trial." And then here's a headline from The Hill. Mary Trump says Ivanka Trump will throw her father, quote, under the bus in fraud trial testimony. What do you make of this? Do you think she's actually going to do that?
I don't think that she's going to save her father, but only because I don't think that there's saving to be done. This case is so full of documentation And that's why the judge ruled on it before we ever heard from a single witness. It's very clear that these statements were wrong, that Donald Trump signed off on them. The statements themselves explicitly attribute the math to him. It's just a tough case for Donald Trump. Is she going to throw her father under the bus? I am very skeptical that she will want to do that. Remember, because Ivanka Trump does not own significant portions of her father's assets, and her father right now we have him estimated at $2.6 billion. If you take $2.6 billion divided by 5 kids, that adds up to a little bit over $500 million. That's $500 million hanging over each one of their heads. I don't think that there's any scenario in which they would voluntarily want to make their father look bad and risk angering him. Now, Ivanka is in a little bit of a different position than her brothers in that she has other family wealth, having married Jared Kushner, whose father is also very wealthy, but who passed his assets down to his kids earlier. So she's much richer than her brothers, but still $500 million is nothing to sneeze at. And I think that she'll try to be careful and protect her father on the stand.
And you're actually going back to the courthouse starting tomorrow. What are you expecting as this trial continues?
Well, so Ivanka's going to be on the stand tomorrow. I think that that testimony may carry a little bit over into the next day. The state of New York then will stop calling witnesses, and it'll be up to the defense team to begin calling witnesses. So there's a chance that they might bring Don Jr. and Eric back onto the stand, and we expect them to bring a lot of experts and appraisers to come on and say, actually Donald Trump is really rich, and this is all, values are super hard to determine, and this case doesn't have merit. I think that those sorts of things will stretch, well into December. Then we'll have closing arguments, and ultimately the judge will make a decision. But, in some ways, he's already decided some of the central components of this case, and he's, telegraphed throughout the proceedings that he doesn't look very charitably upon the Trump camp's position, and so I don't think this is going to go their way.
And you've been in the courthouse for this trial. What has been the most unbelievable moment to you as you've been sitting there?
Well, there have been a lot of really incredible moments, but I think that maybe the most fascinating was the day that Michael Cohen was on the stand. And he seemed to admit to very inconsistent testimony and said that admitted to lying in other instances under oath. And so everything was very tense. He was, had been sort of shaken on the stand, and Trump's lawyers wanted to immediately declare victory, and on the spot asked the judge to end the case. And the judge basically said, heck no way. This case is full of documentation, and the judge saying this, view Michael Cohen as that critical of a witness. So no way, no how that this case is going to be thrown out. At that point, Donald Trump, who was in the room, stood up abruptly. And remember, there's a lot of Secret Service and other officers in the room, and so everyone sort of goes into high alert. And Donald Trump walks out of the room, the door's open. Every time he walks out of the room, it's like a volcano of camera flashes. Everything just bursts. And so it was all of this crazy stuff happening within, a couple of minutes, and just a really wild scene. And maybe it has competition elsewhere in that same day for another crazy thing that took place.
Do you want to talk about it?
Well, that one was that the judge had there was this dispute over Trump's comments in front of the press and whether he was insulting the law clerk that sits next to the judge. And Trump's camp claimed no, that in fact he was insulting Michael Cohen, who's on the other side of the judge and sort of down on the witness stand. And so we come back in from lunch, and the judge says, Mr. Keyes, who's Trump's lawyer, is it your client's position that he in fact was talking about Mr. Cohen and not about my law clerk? And Keyes says yes. And the judge says, okay, we're going to hold a hearing right here, right now. And he says, and I'm going to call a witness to the stand, Donald J. Trump. And so Trump stands up.
Did he look surprised at that moment?
He had to have been surprised. It was impromptu. He hadn't testified, as far as I understand, in open court in 10 years. And all of a sudden, he's up on the stand with his hand up in the air and then seated, and the judge asks him a series of questions. He was up there for maybe 3 minutes saying, yes, I was talking about Michael Cohen. He walks off the stand, and the judge immediately says, I did not find that testimony credible, and you're fined $10,000. And that was all in the same day. So it was a wild day in court.
That is a wild day in court. And before I let you go, can you talk about this law clerk a little bit? Because there seems to be some sort of issue with the law clerk, in Trump's opinion. So
right, yeah. Trump's team would certainly like everyone to think that there's an issue with the law clerk. So the law clerk sits right alongside the judge, and throughout the proceedings is oftentimes passing notes to the judge without knowing what's in those notes or what, she's literally whispering in his ear at various points. Trump's camp has concluded that she is, super partisan and that she has it out to get them. There's not evidence that I've seen that supports that. But nonetheless, they have, been adamant in voicing their objections about her, and Trump has as well. The judge is trying to be defensive of his staff and has said that they've received, many threats to his office and wants to protect his law clerk. And so he has issued a partial gag order on Donald Trump, preventing him from talking about the law clerk, and now has also restricted what his legal team can say because they were voicing a lot of concern about her after the gag order was placed on him. So basically the judge is trying to shut it all down, but I don't think he's going to be able to fully stop the conversation about his law clerk, which seems to be a key feature in the strategy of Trump's legal defense and ultimately their attempts to try to get a mistrial in this case.
Dan, as the trial continues, I hope you come back on and join us and paint a picture of what's happening inside the courtroom. Dan Alexander, thanks for joining me.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.